Jonah, well, he said no. So Jonah got swallowed by a great big fish, and to Nineveh he didn't go. Oh, Jonah, won't you go? Jonah, won't you go? Jonah, won't you go to Nineveh? Jonah, won't you go? Jonah, won't you go? Jonah, go to Nineveh.
It was last week's lesson where we learned about Jonah going the wrong way, and this sudden storm, it was threatening the ship, threatening to sink it, threatening to destroy everybody on board. To the point where they finally cast lots and decided the problem with Jonah, that he, in running away, had endangered them all, and he was cast overboard. And so, as he's thrown overboard, we hear that he goes down into the deeps, but then God sends a big fish. And so you came into the big fish this morning, and here we sit with Jonah in the belly of the beast. And it says here that not only was he swallowed by the big fish, but that he was in there 3 days and 3 nights. Now, had it ended before the fish, it would have been a perfectly good lesson, right? Here's Jonah. He was instructed to go to Nineveh to be the prophet that God wanted him to be. He didn't do that. He went in the opposite direction, sailed on this ship going the opposite way of Nineveh, and as a result, he encounters this storm, and finally he's thrown into the ocean to drown. That would have been a great ending. It would have taught us, if you don't do what God wants you to, then you're going to get thrown overboard too, and it's going to be the end of you. So you better shape up. That would be a perfectly good ending. Maybe we would like that for our children sometime as we're giving them instruction. You better do what you're told to, or there's going to be some serious consequences. And it could have ended right there. But it doesn't. This fish comes out of nowhere and swallows up Jonah. But not only swallows him up, saves him from the destruction that he was facing. And it's given this psalm that he kind of sings or says in the belly of the beast. It's just tremendous, isn't it? Really to describe his situation. He went down below the waters, the billows were over his head, seaweed was wrapped around him at the base of the mountains. And it talks about him being locked into Sheol, which in the Hebrew language was their word for where all the dead went afterwards. He was in with all the dead. Later gets translated as hell, but he says, I was right in there, the gates were closing on me, they were locking on me. It was the end of him. And that's what he expected when he finally said, yeah, you better throw me in the ocean because I don't want everybody on board to go down in this storm. Throw me away, cast me into the ocean. He expected to die. And that's kind of what he experienced afterwards, was that certain death, as things seemed to overwhelm him. But right at that moment, that's when the fish comes and swallows him up. And again, as a gift, as a rescue, that fish comes and saves him. Jonah really got what he wanted. We talked about it last week, that he was trying to flee from God's presence because he didn't want to go to Nineveh. And we kind of thought, as I discussed last week, that there's no place you can go to escape God's presence. And yet here he describes it. He got what he wanted, and he laments it. He says, I've been lost from your sight, O God. And that's the death to him, that he was going down below those waters, lost to God's sight and care. But that's what he had sought. That's what he was trying to escape from, that presence of God. And yet he finds that doing that is fatal to him. It's dangerous. And then he remembers God at that deadly moment. So it took a long time. He got what he wanted, but he didn't really realize the consequences at the time. What it meant to escape from God's presence, to run away from God, and how life-threatening that was, and how challenging. And so he is cast out. But even in the midst of that, this fish coming out of nowhere is a sign of God's grace. And it reminds us that what God wants is not our punishment and our destruction. He had to be cast overboard, but it wasn't in order to punish him. It wasn't in order to destroy him. It was in order to turn around, to bring him back to where he was supposed to be. This is an act of mercy. And so that fish comes out of nowhere, just to Jonah's need, sent by God in order to save him. And I think there's parallels here as you hear that story. Parallels with the story of the prodigal son. And you may remember that story as well, as the son who goes away from the father, escapes him, lives a life of plush living, and finally finds himself destitute. Near death, really. Wondering he would like to eat even the pig's food would give him satisfaction that he's feeding. And out of that, he finally decides that he's going to go back to the father. And in that return, you see, he's practicing his speech, oh, Father, forgive me, I've wasted all your money, and here I am coming back, just treat me as a servant. But even before he's able to say that speech, the Father's already running out to him, putting a cloak on him, putting his special ring, his insignia ring on him that gives him the power of commanding the family and all as well. Kept telling people to slaughter the fatted calf in order that they can throw a great party and rejoice that he's back. All the Father's initiative. Doesn't even wait for the excuses to come from the Son. He just does it. The same here with Jonah as he's thrown overboard, faced with certain death. Doesn't wait for anything. God sends the deliverance. God is merciful. And we find that in our own lives. That in our need, God will be there. Even before we think to ask for it, God is already seeking it for our lives. Seeking for that restoration. Bringing that kind of salvation to us. And so we then can find a way to pray like Jonah does here in thanksgiving for what God has done for us. That as we have followed wrong paths and could have been destroyed, God was already there seeking us, bringing our deliverance, trying to get us back on the right path, to bring that correction, to bring that salvation to us. And so we learn from that great example of Jonah to rejoice ourselves. But it takes a while, of course, to think about it. It certainly did for Jonah, doesn't it? When you get that correction from God, when you do something wrong to somebody, you say the wrong thing, when you hurt somebody very badly, sometimes things happen so fast that we just do the wrong things. And we don't know enough to correct them, do we, right away? And so we go away and think, gee, I really handled that badly. I should have done better. If I'd really been thinking, this is what I would have said, that would have been really helpful. And that's what Jonah gets. In that belly of the beast, and as we sit here, and often as we come here week to week, we get to think about things. Reconsider the way we've acted and think, how could we have done it better? How could we now be God's followers and Christ's disciples? What is it that we need to change? And sometimes we need that time to let it incubate within us, to let it grow so that we finally, oh yeah, now I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to make things right. I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do in the first place. That is the example of Jonah. And I think that's one of the things that struck me as I reread it again and again this week. First it says he was thrown overboard and swallowed up by that big fish, and he was in there for 3 days and 3 nights. And then it says, then he prayed to God. He sat there for 3 days and 3 nights, thinking it over, probably grumbling to himself, I'm not going to do what he wants just because God wants me to do it. What can I do now? But then he starts to realize the salvation that he has received, that he was in a direction of certain death, just being thrown overboard, and that fish was actually a work of grace, a work of God. And so instantaneously he gets swallowed up, and then he thinks about it, and sits there for 3 days and 3 nights, probably a little bit warm and moist like it is in here today. We thought maybe we could do a scratch and sniff version, but it probably smelled like rotten fish in here if we were really in the belly of that beast. But where we have to just go away and turn ourselves around and think about it and come to a new conclusion. There are times in our lives when we need to do that. But we do it in thanksgiving like Jonah does. That God was already working. When we got in trouble, when we did the wrong thing, before we even knew to ask for help, God was there. And in response to God's works in our lives, think it over, we take the time, we come to new conclusions, we make new resolutions, we're going to do it better, we are going to be better. And finally we can return and say, thank you, God. Now I see it. You were working for me, even in the midst of that storm. When I thought all was lost in my life, in hindsight, I can see that you were there and that you have brought me safely through. Thanks be to God. And when we come to that point, God talks to the fish and we get spit out again. And we're back to the path of God's disciples. Called to be God's disciples. Let us rejoice and give thanks. Amen.
Well, God told Jonah go to Nineveh. Jonah, well, he said no. So Jonah got swallowed by a great big fish, and to Nineveh he didn't go. Oh, Jonah, won't you go? Jonah, won't you go? Jonah, won't you go to Nineveh? Jonah, won't you go? Jonah, won't you go? Jonah, go to Nineveh. Oh, Jonah, won't you go? Jonah, won't you go? Jonah, won't you go to Nineveh? Jonah, won't you go? Jonah, won't you go? Jonah, go to Nineveh. Oh, Jonah, won't you go? Jonah, won't you go? Jonah, won't you go to Nineveh? Jonah, won't you go?